to digital life online and what kind of networks we see there. Okay, a slide I didn't show you from the last section might help you in ways to think about how you're positioned in a network and how there's always various different actors and agents, to use some of the vocabulary we talked about when we were thinking about self and community identity last week. This is a picture from Robert Darnton's seminal article called What is the History of the Book? Now, it's all the way back from 1982, but it's foundational in the field of book history. And what he was looking at was a network of communication and exchange called the communication circuit. When the printing press was well enough developed that there was a substantial book publishing industry, he was trying to think about all of the actors and agents and where they were placed in that. So normally we think about a book as determined by, and the meaning of it as determined by the author. That's a very simple way of thinking about how a book communicates. But here at the very top here of the hierarchy, he does have the author in communication with a publisher. A publisher shapes a book as well. But then if you follow the circle around, then there are printers, compositors, pressmen, warehousemen, suppliers who supply paper, ink, type, and labor. So there are a lot of different actors involved there as well. And you put this down below and follow the circle around, you get to the shippers, the agents, the wagoners, the people who are pulling it along to where it might be sold. And these are the booksellers, who might be wholesalers or retailers or peddlers in their wagon or somebody at a market, for example. And then you follow that along and you finally get to the end point of the communication chain, and you get readers. And they are either people who have bought a book or purchased a magazine, or they're people who are borrowing a book from a library or from a friend. They may be somebody who belongs to a club, like Book of the Month Club, or the School of Arts, for example, which were early libraries in Australia. Or they may be somebody who goes to a public library, a university library, for example. So those are the major actors, and they all have some position in terms of determining communication, but none of them ultimately determines the communication, but they all have some angle, right? And you can see they all have various different interests and power dynamics going on here as well. You can see how the author, for example, might have intellectual interests or influences. You can see how the booksellers are publicists in some way. We didn't like to think about books as having anything to do with publicity, just as journalists didn't like to think of the news as having anything to do with anything salacious or gossip related at all. But we've come to recognize in book history now that all authors require some form of promotion for their book to find an audience. And that audience and that promoter might be of various grade. So the way we promote maybe a self-published book or a self-help book, for example, into a wide audience might be, or a small local audience might be different than how we would promote something that we or a publisher hoped would have cultural prestige and cultural capital, for example. You can see as well that there's economic and social influences here. Some people are involved in this just to make money. Some people are there to play some sort of a social role, but they all have something to do with one another. And then there is the introduction of political and legal sanctions as well. There's only certain things you're allowed to publish. Newspapers may be subject to libel, for example, or be censored by or censured by media arbiters who oversee the media, as we've seen in the history of communications here. So there are power interests here at different points as well. Or there are people who may establish power because of their publicity. And you can think about how this transfers to the net, right? Where we got to kind of go, well, there are people who are in it just for money. There are people who are actually just doing labor. They're laboring to get code up there. There are people who are there for social capital or for economic capital. There's attempts of the government to impose legal sanctions, for example. There are people who are there for intellectual reasons or other reasons to find information. So you need to think about the position in the network. And we can transfer that over here. This takes us to posthumanism. Posthumanism sounds like a very confusing term, and humanism is confusing enough. But let's just remind ourselves what humanism is. Humanism developed in the Renaissance. Remember the image of Michelangelo's Vitruvian Man. It is putting man at the center of the universe, no longer God at the center of the universe. And it led to empiricism and subsequently science, where we then, using our senses, gathered information and developed the scientific method and tested it, which then led to a particular idea of a very individual self rather than a communitarian self. So humanism is a version of self and identity and of the world that is organized along those principles. But when we talked about self and community identity, about how humans are not always singular, right? We have multiple selves over a period of our lifetime as we develop, but also we project multiple versions of ourselves into different audiences. We tell certain things to our mom and dad and different things to our friends. And we're not always rational, as Freud showed and as Beethoven showed. We're people who are driven by emotion and sometimes by fantasy or ego or appetite. We talked about, when we thought about post-structuralism, how societies and structures often determine who we are and how we feel about things. And we are less agents and authors of our own experience than we would like to think. Posthumanism takes us a little bit further than post-structuralism even yet, because it challenges the boundary between the human and the non-human. It begins to think about the way in which humans interface with technology in ways that are slightly more sophisticated than, but draw on the ideas that we looked at in the previous part of the lecture. The ideas, for instance, of Habermas or of McLuhan, for example, or of Eisenstein. Because the post-human also talks about the development of the digital self. And this is something that was theorized by Donna Haraway in the early days of the internet when we still talked about cyberspace. She talked about how she was seeing the emergence of collapsed boundaries between technology and human. When we walk around with our iPhones all of the time, or when we need to use Siri as a robot to tell us where to go, for example, she talks about us being not just post-humanist, where we're no longer talking about the individual self who is an agent of our own experience and singular, but she's also talking about us being beyond human, and uses in her work the cyborg as a metaphor for modern life, of humans at the interface of technology. Therefore, she says humans are multiple, depending on how we are interfacing with our technology and contingent on that technology. And Catherine Hales took this a little bit longer. She said she saw a new form of subjectivity developing at the interface between people's bodies and computer-based technologies. I can tell you my disc that has been bulged from all the sitting at the computer, recording lectures and doing everything online these days sure tells me that my bodies are being changed by computer-based technologies. I spend all this time staring at these semiotics, little box, as I was saying online, I think, to somebody in our external group the other day. But she's also thinking about other forms that technologies are changing our bodies. For example, the introduction of the birth control pill, or the heart, for example, with a pacemaker now. We can even have heart transplants, for example, and organ transplants. So we are more than our organic selves. We have been transformed by technology. And so thinking about this on the internet means that the nature of self and identity on the internet is not the humanist singular Cartesian self, but a networked self, co-produced by the technology. Now, Mark Zuckerberg made his famous statement once when he saw people were starting to have fake Facebook accounts, and he was seeing the proliferation of the way in which people from below were developing tactics of power to subvert the way that he had designed the system to be as his strategy. And Laurie McNeil is a life writing scholar. Like a number of life writing scholars in this period, she began to think about how people blogging and Facebooking and Instagramming and TikToking was kind of a new form of autobiography, not the diary as it once was classically conceived of as private and locked away, but something that was happening in public. And countering Mark Zuckerberg's point that you have to be authentically yourself, she actually said there is no I in network, which was a statement that basically said, Mark Zuckerberg's point is an oversimplified way of understanding self and communication. So communication is always already the self-filter through structures that partly determine us. We've learned this already. So she said it's not as simple as there being a real versus a fake self, but rather she talks about selfhood as performative, and we learned what that meant when we thought about Judith Butler last week. So she said a self that I know of these days, now post Judith Butler, is a selfhood that is understood as being shaped by audience expectations or purposely attempting to subvert those audience expectations. So she said, we're not just authentic or real. That's too simplistic. We are determined in part by others, but now, in fact, the others by whom we're being determined are technological as well. So technology, aka the medium, is the thing that is partly determining the way in which we are shaping versions of ourselves online. So we're being shaped by the medium or by the platform, like Facebook. And of course, by language still too, and now by pictures that are increasingly proliferating on the internet, by selfies, by TikToks. Whatever the affordance of that given social media network is partly now shaping the performance of ourselves and the stories, therefore, we tell about ourselves. Social networking sites like Facebook and Instagram, therefore, cultivate, according to McNeil and other scholars, a form of post-humanist autobiography that is partly co-authored by the software or the algorithm and partly co-authored by others, our audience, our intended audience, for example, for whom we perform for likes. So we need to think about the technological structures as well as where we're positioned in a network. When we might want to think about the stories we are telling now as not singular, contained in books, but as networked, connected to one another in ways that have changed the nature of privacy, for example, that we co-produce stories of ourselves on Facebook or on other social media platforms with the technology, and by commenting on each other's posts, performing for an expected audience, or by having certain kinds of narratives shaped by that particular network. And so we need to then think about the commercial investments of any particular social media platform. Going back to Habermas, when he talked about the transformation of the public sphere and how it was being structured away from a place of organic community into a place where there were vested commercial interests, the Murdoch empire, for example, where we know there are certain ways that news is now being shaped. It may not be censorship as it was in the days of Milton's Areopagitica, but it certainly is shaping, selecting, and omitting what is told, for example. So how does who owns the means of production, which was a question that Habermas is asking, on the site that you are looking at or the platform that you are looking at, influence or shape what we say? What is the purpose of a social media site? And how can you maybe detect its hidden agenda? Facebook originated as a dating site, and that also helps give us a sense of the sorts of consumer preferences. It's because there's also a commercial investment in getting advertisers. That's how Facebook makes it. That's its economic profit model. And so it asks you things like, especially in the early days, about your gender preferences and about your consumer preferences, and try to gather information because it was selling your information. Of course, most of you have now seen the movie, the social network, I think it's called. I'll look it up for you later, but you'll know it, I'm sure. In which it very convincingly suggests that the algorithm produces you as a sexual identity in the early days of Facebook, or as a consumer identity, or however it's producing you now. So we need to think about language too, and cultures on the internet. Tuan said language and the act of naming converts mere objects out there into real presences. So this weird electronic space seems to be real now. It's become a place because our interactions with it and the way we have made it through semiotics participates in a process of world making and various world makings, right? And the internet is a space that has been turned into various places made entirely by pictures, icons, words, and memes, which are its semiotics and codes. So ask yourself which world is being called into existence by its set of signs and acts of telling that it uses. How does its representational choices or limits, what are its focalizations and omissions? And how does what it offers or doesn't offer its users shape what is sayable, knowable, and the kind of message that is transmitted? So the semiotic structures of the net are, of course, memes, likes, hearts, friends, followers, and all of the other things. So we can also see that there's new forms of power that are emerging in this new communication circuit, right? Or I call it new, but it's 20 years old. And we can also think about, fantasy. We talked about that a little bit last week on the internet, the ideal self that's projected, or the appetites that run wild, But we can also think about the myths and stories, perhaps, that undergird maybe some social media based on gaming, for example. So a question to pose to ourselves is, and it's a question I think we've all been debating about in social media itself and on the broadsheets and in the regular news, traditional news sphere, is this a reinvigorated public sphere in the terms that Habermas thought about it, one that helps make a better democracy, where people are actively talking to a truly representational public, or is it a further breaking down of the public sphere? We need to realize that we think about, perhaps back to Benedict Anderson's ideas about the newspaper being distributed by the steam train across giant swaths of nations, states that couldn't have existed before that technology because people couldn't have communicated without it across vast distances. What giant vast distances people are able to reach across now. New publics reaching across global space without the intermediaries of newspapers or the corporate media. But we also need to ask ourselves, how truly global is it? How free is it when issues of focalization, selection, agenda setting, omission, which once characterized newspapers, remain? Or is this panopticon now set by us under our terms? How did Trump, for example, set the agenda with Twitter? Finally, I'd like you to think about the relationship to people and the public as now changing on the internet. And I'd like to suggest to you, as a number of theorists, beginning with L.I. Parser, in 2011, who coined the phrase the filter bubble, that we are perhaps seeing a further breakdown of the public sphere. And I will try to put this little TED Talk up of a web based on your news filter. I think if you've seen the movie, The Social Network, you know how this works. But we are increasingly seeing the rise, therefore, of closed-in social networks that don't have a lot of weak links to the outside. They're tribe members that have strong affiliations. There's the anti-vaxxers and the pro-vaccination people who are virtue signaling right now on the internet. And we're not going to get into an argument right now about vaccination hesitancy or any of these things, but I just want to suggest that the technology of the internet and the way we communicate now and share information and what is trustable to us, who has the ethos, has been profoundly changed by the way in which the digital technology is changing networks of communication. So that is that for today. Thank you for your attention this week, and I look forward to reading your blogs and reading your external discussions, and also hearing what you have to say in tutorial this week. Thanks.